Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where we unpack the question, can AI actually work without an IT knowledge base? Before we dive into answering the question, I want to go over a few housekeeping items first. First of all, this session is being recorded. We will follow up with the recording for all of our attendees in the days to follow. On top of that, you'll see there's both a chat and a QA section at the bottom of your screen. Please use the QA section for any questions you have for our panelists. We've left time at the end to answer any questions you do have. And feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself and talk to other attendees. But please leave all your questions for the panelists for that Q&A section. But without any holdup, I will hand it over to our two speakers today. We've got two of Fixify's co-founders. We've got Matt Peters, the CEO, and Peter Silverman, the CTO. Over to you guys.
Thanks so much, Molly. Just by way of introduction, I'm Matt Peters, as Molly mentioned. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders here at Fixify. I've been building teams, products, and companies for over 25 years, and most recently in the IT space, where we've been working a lot in this topic area.
I'm Peter Silverman. I'm the one of the other co-founders. I'm CTO and responsible for product engineering, data science, and the operations team. And prior to Fixify, spent about 25 years in cybersecurity, but I'm really excited to have left, which is a weird thing to say, but we're excited to be in the IT space and building something pretty cool.
So to start with, I did want to just set a little bit of the stage around, like, why are Pete and I talking about this topic? Like, why, what insight are we going to lend? And for a bit of context, at Fixify, we're reimagining the way help desk works in the AI era. And what that means is we're building a platform which is a combination of AI and automation that helps deliver high quality help desk for folks. That's basically made up of three big components. There's sort of a categorization and learning moment where tickets come in and we categorize, we understand what they are. And then there's mapping that to a knowledge base, mapping that to a corpus of knowledge about how to execute in a particular environment around those things. That might be getting somebody an answer or actually doing something to resolve a ticket, that kind of thing. And then there's an execution layer. And so we're building a platform that consists of all three. As part of doing that, we've been building this knowledge base notion, and we've been working with a lot of customers in both deployment scenarios or talk to them about problems that they've run into. And what we become fascinated by is the interplay between sort of modern large language model based technologies and this notion of knowledge bases. And to the question that we posed, can AI work without an IT knowledge base? One of the experiences, or the sum total, I guess I'd say, of our experiences kind of leads us to believe that actually to get the most out of most of the AI technologies that you're likely to deploy, having a reasonably high quality knowledge base is not necessarily a prerequisite, but it's definitely a condition that's useful. It actually reminds me a bit of an old joke. And so at the risk of being the old guy with the joke, I would just say, like, there's this old Shaggy Dog story about a guy who needs to replace a light bulb. It's burned out in his house, and he goes to replace the light bulb, and he realizes that while he's doing it, that the light fixture is a little bit wobbly. So to fix the fixture, he then needs to go patch the ceiling because he realizes the ceiling needs patching. And then to patch the ceiling, he realizes his roof leaks. And when he gets up to fix the roof, he realizes the chimney needs rebuilding. And by the end of it, he's basically rebuilt his whole house. And the joke is kind of reminiscent to me of some of the stuff that we're seeing, because what we're seeing for folks is people are trying to deploy, in particular, IT answer bots. Pete and I tend to refer to these as deflection technologies, right? These are the bots that you'll put in a Slack channel, and you'll ask it a question, and then it'll turn around and try to answer it based on some set of stuff it knows. You can think about, like, Atlassian Assist is a canonical example of this. ServiceNow has their technology. A lot of your ticketing systems have these. And at the end of the day, when they do deploy these things, a lot of times the experience they've been having is these things give bad answers. And when they dig into, like, okay, why are the answers bad, or why is the end user experience not that great? What they're discovering is that it's actually the quality of their knowledge base articles. And so, like, this then becomes a question of, like, okay, how much plumbing do we have to put in this knowledge base to actually make it so that it can power this AI bot? Now, it's tempting, and this is the place where we get interested in it, and we're going to spend a bit of time talking about this. It's tempting to actually say, like, okay, like, let's just point some smart bots at a pile of documents and away we go. And it's actually, the problem's actually a bit more complex than that. And this is where I think, like, AI is only shining a light on something. This is not a new problem. Since 3,000 years ago when somebody pulled out wet clay and pressed reeds into it in ancient Sumeria and invented writing. Knowledge management is a canonical like problem that we've had, and it's just and it's rooted kind of in the context of sort of like human interaction. So what we're going to do is spend a little bit of time unpacking the issues surrounding knowledge management, and then we're going to dive into like how they show up in IT organizations particularly, and then some of the things that we've seen that have helped people solve them. And then at the end of it, we'll give you a little bit of a demo of a portion of what we built to kind of give you an idea, and we'll leave you with some sort of things as you're implementing, things that you can look at to try to optimize your own deployments.
And just to call out that Matt just recently rebuilt his house, so
Yeah, no, there is definitely, yeah,
good story
absolutely.
there.
I'm not speaking from not experience. The last thing to call out here is that I'm not doing any of this to poo-poo the potential for AI. Actually, AI has got a huge amount of potential for revolutionizing the way that AI works. It just doesn't change fundamentally the context that exists in, right? So when we think about the problems of knowledge management, there's sort of like 4 or 5 that are kind of canonical. These are the things when you're thinking about how technologies interact and how they particularly deal with knowledge management. There's sort of these 4 big problems that we see. And the first one is like knowledge capture. And that's like, part of it is how do you get things written down and stored in the first place? That's kind of the easy way to say it, but it's basically like, how do you end up building the systems and the process and the technology to actually take things and turn them into knowledge that other people can reference? That's kind of a huge topic in and of itself. The second thing is the form of the knowledge. And actually, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but this idea that there's a difference between tacit knowledge, the kind of stuff that everybody in your organization is walking around with in their heads, and explicit knowledge, stuff that's actually written down. And I will tell you the number one thing we see people running into when they start working with knowledge capture, if there's these don't necessarily go in order, but when you start with knowledge capture, you start trying to crack that code, you run into almost immediately like, what things do we actually need to write down? As a funny side note, and just sort of like an example of this that I think is kind of funny, in the Old Testament, Noah's Ark, right, was I think it was like 60 cubits or 300 cubits by 50 cubits. And the funny thing is nobody actually knows how big it was because nobody wrote down how big a cubit was, right? And so it's like, it's that kind of thing where they're like, well, of course, everybody knows what a cubit is. We just put down the measurements, we're done. But in reality, there were certain things that, so the modern day equivalent of that is escalate to HR. Well, if you're a new IT person, you might not know who the HR team is or how to escalate, that sort of stuff. So like that's the difference between sort of making something tacit and making something explicit.
And I think, Matt, I was just gonna jump in. I think also one of the things we've seen is like capture. One of the ways people try to solve it is just by will and sheer force of like, we're going to keep writing. Everyone's going to write 1 document a week or what have you to try to capture this. But going back to the earlier thing we talked about, like, but if they're not high quality, how much use is 1 document a week? It actually might make things worse. And so thinking about like, when you think about capture and then what you're capturing, which would be the form, those 2 things are quite important to think about, but you don't often think about them when you're trying to build out these knowledge bases and knowledge management. And then that has this cascading effect of poor delivery, poor quality, or poor automation down the road as you try to build stuff on top of a shaky foundation.
No, exactly. And the thing there is when we think about every single one of these, and the reason why we're sort of approaching the topic from the perspective of like, hey, we've got this problem, but it's linked to this problem, which is linked to this problem, and understanding the relationships is because there isn't a brute force solution. We've talked to like literally at this point hundreds of customers deploying technologies, and in the places where they've deployed them well, it was because they understood the sort of spider web of impacts, as opposed to I have a hammer meet nail. Very rarely with these kinds of technologies is it as simple as hammer meet nail. It's much more, I'm deploying a complex technology in a complex environment, which actually brings us to provenance. This is kind of a fancy word. I like it a lot, but basically what it means is how does the knowledge cascade across your system? So like these documents are related to each other and they're edited by multiple different people. So if you imagine your average IT knowledge base, you're going to have the documents that your team has produced. Okay, fine. But you're also likely to have some stuff that's like contributed to by HR, or like you're going to have a document that references a policy that was written by legal, something like this. And so the provenance of that information is now outside your team, and you have to start thinking about things like, okay, like how fresh is that information? How often do we have to check it? How often do we have to go back to those editors? When people make upstream edits, do they have the potential for messing up the entire system? And that's the thing that we've seen a lot of, is that the system might work well on the closed form documentation that IT maintains, because maybe it's in rigorous and it's in, it's all shoved in Confluence and great. But then the second they're saying, and by the way, we have these legal policies, those are held in a totally different system, and everything begins to break down. There are technologies that try to bridge that, but they run into a whole bunch of problems that then cascade back to form and capture, right? Which is, hey, the documents that legal writes and the documents that IT write, they don't look the same, that sort of thing.
I think that the thing that comes to mind here is like knowledge decays the minute you're done writing it. It's kind of like driving a car off the lot that depreciates the minute it leaves the lot. Almost in any organization, the knowledge you document is going to evolve and decay close to immediate, especially if it's a fast-growing organization, which is a lot of the customers we talk to. And so thinking about ways to embrace that and what you do in updating it, or how you think about freshness, or does it matter, or mechanisms there, are pretty important for scale and quality.
Yeah. And that then brings us to the last thing. And this is one where actually, when you think about the new technologies, these new, particularly in AI deflection bots, AI answer bots, are fundamentally trying to solve a very particular problem, which is retrieval, right? How do you actually get at the answer to the question or the information that you specifically need? We're going to talk a little bit and actually take you through a bit of a timeline, because there's lots of technologies that try to solve that problem that go back pretty far. And actually, one of the, as an interesting historical note, it was actually 4,000 years worth of writing before they introduced the index in a book, right? But that was one of the first technologies that was like, we're going to make it easier for people to look up information that they need. The key thing is that problem, like the answer bot, is one environment in which you need to retrieve information in one form. A lot of times what we're finding is you also have a notion where somebody needs to do a structured search, right? Or they need to be able to do a sort of a traversal through information. I need to go from one document to some supporting documents to some additional supporting documents, that kind of thing. Those are different styles of retrieval. And so when you're looking at technologies, particularly AI technologies, know that that's one solution to one portion of this problem. It is not the entire problem. And so you really do end up needing to think about, okay, how does it index the data? How is the data connected? That sort of stuff is hugely important.
And I know Matt loves history lessons, but there's a more recent kind of interesting comparative, contemporary, if you will, not within the past 4,000 years, but more in the past couple of years, of like, when you think about large language models, their retrieval and then the provenance question is really an interesting one. And you're seeing more and more of that because, we've all seen the stories of the lawyer in New York that produced a brief that referenced made up case law because the LLM essentially generated the case law, and that goes to provenance and retrieval and the kind of grounding these models. And even if you give it your own documents, at the end of the day, the LLMs are transforming it. And so figuring out how to manage that and looking at not just one way to solve this problem, but a couple different ways to solve this problem, I think is key as we think about knowledge management and high quality deflection that results in the end user not being annoyed.
So if we dive in a bit to knowledge capture for a second, when we think about this, the thing and the takeaway out of knowledge capture that I think if you took one thing away from this topic, the thing I would abjure you to take away is that knowledge capture is not a thing you do. It is a system you build, okay? And that system, just like any other IT system, just like any other technology system, really any other corporate system, actually consists of processes, people, and technology. And to neglect any component in that triumvirate is actually going to cost you pretty dearly. So, for example, when we think about things like the people portion of the thing, if we're trying to say, hey, look, we need to convert knowledge, it's very important for us to think about, are we setting aside time for our teams to do this? Do we have structured, document reviews? Do we reward and recognize people for this sort of stuff? These are all like critically important, right?
I would also add, if you think about hiring an IT analyst and you think about your interview process, how many folks are interviewing for people who can write well? Like, just leave that on the table. Or are you interviewing for customer service, technical ability to problem solve, and and writing is an afterthought? And if it's an afterthought, that makes sense because most IT people didn't go to IT field to write. They went in to solve problems and work with people, or solve problems and not work with people, depending on who you're talking to. But the key thing is they didn't go in to be great authors. And so if that's then the expectation, like, how are you enabling them? And I think that's a useful question to ask yourself as you're thinking about knowledge management and generating the right knowledge content.
And to dovetail on that practically, what it would look like. We've seen some best in class on this, where companies have really built really good systems for doing this to empower their people. And one of the things that was kind of universal across them was they all had a notion of like, this is what a good knowledge base article looks like, and this is why it's good, and they trained to it, right? And so like, and Pete and I actually had this experience at our previous job when we sat down with the team and we said, look, this is what documentation needs to look like, but we're not just going to tell you this is what it needs to look like. We're going to tell you why this is good. It ended up improving just like overnight the quality of the documentation. The effect was quantum because people want to do a good job, but a lot of times nobody's ever actually explained like, okay, why would you say it this way, or why does this sentence structure work? Now, what's interesting here is when you then map that through quality control, sometimes large language models treat documentation a little bit differently than humans do. So you do sometimes have to like trade off between I'm writing this for a human to consume, or I'm writing this for a large language model to consume as a thing. And so you got to think a little bit about your audience. But at the end of the day, actually sitting down, if you're looking at this and you're saying, I have my team working on making sure that our knowledge base is up to scratch because we're implementing a tool, and you don't have a place where you can point at it and say, I've trained them all on what a good knowledge base article looks like, the initial quality going in is going to be variable likely, and coming out it will be likely even more variable. That's actually an amplification that we see from these models. But more importantly, even if you have good quality going in, you haven't trained it, so the next person you hire is just going to have a world of hurt, right? So that's part of that. You're building a system. You're not just building a one moment in time kind of a thing.
I also think that there's an interesting pressure that's being applied because, we've talked to some folks who would operate best in class IT operations, but in general, if we polled over the hundreds of conversations we've had with prospects and customers and said, show me what good playbook quality look like, and we had them riff, it would be a scatter plot. It'd be a Jackson Pollock painting all over the place. And I think that speaks to the lack of thought that goes into it, but now the importance of having it, because people recognize that this knowledge can be leveraged for other systems in a way that a couple of years ago wasn't the case. It was, can a human read it and make some amount of sense out of it, and what does quality mean at that point? So I think there's interesting pressure being applied as we watch this kind of technical transformation occur, and people run towards how do we enable these systems so I can create efficiencies, create leverage, and hopefully increase quality. But it wasn't the case a couple of years ago, and I think there's standards and shared understanding that's missing within a lot of the industry.
And diving in a little bit, one of the other things that people have in this sort of like, we've drawn this out and said, look, like, write down everything, right? That might not actually be the thing that you need to do. And Pete, I think you have some thoughts along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked to a lot of folks and done our own kind of thinking on this, and some of it is understanding where the Pareto curve is and what the value or return on your investment is. And that can also inform when you think about the freshness of data. If it's something that's being used infrequently, that might be something you can check in less frequently, whereas something that's being used frequently would allow you to focus on checking in on that more frequently. So to make that concrete, think about playbooks where application management is the canonical example. Within our customer base makes up anywhere from 70 to 85% of all ticket volume is something related to an application or access request. That process is incredibly important, and having it accurate and up to date can be a focus area. And you can understand the value of the quality of the playbook when you look at the coverage and you say, hey, this playbook is being used by this analyst in this situation consistently, versus this playbook should be used in this situation but isn't, or the analyst, if you have the ability to see if they're deviating from the steps, that can also flag it. So looking for not just the documentation but how it's being leveraged is I think a key way and a key metric to think about the quality, and also to help proactively identify where things are fresh or aren't fresh. And if you're looking for kind of general rules of the road of how to think about updates, some of it could be usage and then leverage. And those two components then inform the lift you get and where your focus wants to be as a team. Some of it is hard because a lot of times folks in IT are working in like a ticketing system and then pivoting to a knowledge management. They don't have that connective tissue, but that would be where creating that connective tissue actually drives higher quality. And that could be a more valuable activity at first. Hey, how do we link the tickets we're working with the knowledge management, and then increasing the knowledge management instead of going to everyone's going to write an article a week. You start with how do I create that awareness and that relationship between the tickets and the knowledge that's being used, because that will then feed and make the impact of the knowledge you create that much more effective and valuable.
And just to dovetail on that, starting with metrics, even if you're starting with kind of poor metrics, is usually a better springboard into these. So if you're thinking about, so Pete just talked about knowledge management from the perspective of doing playbooks for IT problem solving. If you're thinking about deploying a deflection technology, an answer bot tool, if you're starting out that journey, one thing you may want to do is take a few minutes to figure out, okay, what are my most commonly asked questions? If you're already being asked questions, if you have an Ask IT channel and it just doesn't have a bot in it or something like this, do you have an ability to categorize, go in and use the Slack API or just elbow grease or ChatGPT to go through those questions and get sort of what are my top talkers? Because I'm prepared to guarantee you that you have a curve where about 65% of your questions are all surrounding the same sets of things, and knowing what those are can give you those outsized rewards, like really focusing in on those, and then you have this slightly longer tail. The second piece is when you think about building processes out, you can really inform them with that data. So, like, I'm going to quickly sprint to get that 63% coverage. And then longer term, as I go and I figure out what these longer tail questions and issues are, then what I know there I need to do is I just need to check in more, less frequently, but I need to make sure to remind myself to check in on the quality of those answers because they don't get asked as frequently. And if we don't do something frequently, we tend to forget it and screw it up. So then pivoting a little bit, thinking about this. So there's a canonical problem. We mentioned this about like when you're writing things down, what needs to be tacit and what needs to be explicit. And actually, like this is a thing that you're in control of. And it's not always true that you want to move everything from tacit to explicit. In point of fact, there's times when you want to have something like tacit knowledge. An example is like the thing you're walking around in your head. Like you happen to know, for instance, like what the name of the person is at the front desk. That's not written down anywhere, but you just happen to know that as an example. Or you happen to know, hey, where do I go to ask HR a question, but that may not actually be written down anywhere in your organization. It's just the kind of thing that people just know, right? Versus explicit knowledge where it's like I can go to my wiki or I can go to my corporate information base and actually find a sentence that has the answer to the question I'm looking for. It's not always true that you want everything written down. And in point of fact, I'll give you an example. Like, I don't know how many of you are doing this, and at the risk of deviating from our topic, one of the things we found a lot of people getting a lot of leverage from is if you have a new hire onboarding process that involves sort of presentations from different departments, if IT is coming to that and saying, hey, this is sort of IT in general, these are the big systems we tend to use and the problems they tend to solve, that's not actually explicitly building knowledge. You're not writing that down. What you're doing is you're actually having that now rattle around in people's heads so that when they're making decisions, they can go, oh, I think I remember the IT person mentioning this. Let me go figure something out, right? So like you're actually like, that's an example of pushing things more on the tacit side of knowledge, right? On the explicit side, again, at the risk of deviating, I don't know if anybody's had this experience before, but in working in an office and having the power go out and then realize that the only way we have IT's phone number or facility's phone number is because it's on a wiki and the power's out and we can't get to it, realize we need to make that explicit. It needs to get printed out and put on the wall. And so when you're doing that, you really have to be a little bit concerted about which type of knowledge is which. But this is where most people end up struggling with AI-based knowledge bases, is because in a lot of cases, they're assuming a lot more knowledge that's just walking around in their head.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback off that. I think another example that we've seen that would kind of speak to the tacit or tribal knowledge is if you think about onboarding a new IT analyst, for example, you're going to walk them through some processes, some systems. But in our experience, you don't always walk them through how you communicate, how you talk to end users. That's tacit. That's in each team member, or it's tribal. It's in each team member's head, right? But when we engage with customers, they're like, hey, we talk in this way. We're informal. We use emojis. We address people by their first name. They have all of it in their head and they can articulate it. It's just not something that's actually written out and handed to an analyst. And that's a really that's a very concrete example of something we've seen. And actually, when you start to think about, well, how would you go figure that out? That's where it gets really interesting, where you can actually reverse engineer some of this tacit and tribal knowledge by looking at communication patterns or looking at the residue of process in other systems and say, oh, I see these steps. They're not documented anywhere, but I can actually infer what's happening and then actually make that concrete and make that explicit. So it's not just hyperbole that we're talking about here. It's actually something that in practice we're both doing and seeing from when like customers have feedback or things they want to see changed in the product or platform.
So turning to provenance, Pete's going to talk us through a little bit, but one of the key things to note is provenance is one of those ever-existing problems, right? It's ever since people have been writing things down, sort of trying to figure out what relates to what, and then how to track these sort of fields of updates, right? One of the things is there's lots of technologies, many of which you probably already deployed, that have tried to solve certain aspects of this. And this isn't to say that the fact that there are newer technologies means some of those older technologies failed, right? It's really to say that, like, as we've gone, our capability for answering particular types of problems has improved. So, these very early things where it was literally just around like, let's hierarchically organize the information, that was kind of best in class at the time. But there are still very, very good use cases for hierarchical information organization versus, some of this natural language free indexing. So, Pete.
Yeah, so I think, as you can tell from Matt, he loves history, and I think history can be a useful analogy some of the time, and I think this is one of those times that we'll keep it in the past 35 years. When we look back, we can kind of draw this through line of, as more people came online, we had more websites, we had more need to search, access, and understand content, and build more systems. It all kind of tracks as a through line, and it kind of, provenance is a key part of that story. So if you go back to the early days of the web, you had essentially explicit registration, right? If you think Mark Andreessen had an index where people would put their website, right? And that's what Netscape used. And you had Yahoo with a directory and Alta Vista. And so you had this kind of explicit nature, and there wasn't that much content, there weren't many people. So provenance was really one-to-one, and this person registered this website. Then you move to the next kind of phase we look at in the early 2000s, and that gets interesting because you start to see the crowdsourcing come online. In the case of tools that were around in the 2000s, you had like Wikipedia. You had tracking changes in Microsoft Word, if we remember that feature. That was actually a really interesting form of provenance. You were sending docs around, but you were tracking changes, so you had that, and it was more of a collaborative experience. Git, the protocol, the decentralized kind of collaboration for source code, was a mid-2000s creation. And so you had this kind of crowdsourcing and starting to be bottoms up knowledge capture coming about in these examples. And then you also started to see different forms of provenance and auditing that came out. SharePoint was a 2001 creation, along with the Wikipedia that I mentioned. So we go from there to the mid 2000s, the 2010s, and it gets more interesting. Now you have more people online, you have more systems online, and you go from Git comes mainstream with GitHub. You've got Confluence and SharePoint. Google Docs is a really interesting one. And when you look at what SharePoint and Google Docs were optimizing for, they were different, right? Google Docs was starting to move to like really optimizing for real-time collaboration. You remember seeing the avatars and people typing, and you could almost it was like a chat interface because it was real time, and that was really interesting. It got more decentralized. And in the era of kind of web, you had Google taking over, right? You had Quora and Stack Overflow coming online, and that's the furtherance of crowdsourcing into these essentially the mid 2000s, and then the need for the audit trails came about. And then finally, I think it gets interesting because there's a phase in between today and enterprise where, as systems and automation were coming online, you kind of had this need for tracking data and data lineage. You always had it, and you started to see it growing both in the collaboration, but you started to see projects, open source especially, around data lineage. Apache Atlas was brought out by Hortonworks from the mid 2010s. LinkedIn released something called Data Hub. Lyft has Amazon. These are all like internal catalogs mapping how data flows. And they're really answering the question, if I tweak this field or I change this data, what is a cascading impact? Because you also started to have microservices, microservices as a nomenclature entered the conversation. So you started to have automation that was impacted. And you start to see the same audit trails needed both in collaboration, but also in system automation. And that brings us to kind of LLMs.
And if we can pause for just a second, as we're thinking about these things, the key thing to take away from that sort of history is there are plenty of places you can go. Like I could literally go to probably most of your companies, and we could find, oh, well, we've got a wiki over here, and we use, we use Confluence, and we do this and we do that. And the reason that these technologies are still very useful is because they've solved certain classes of problems that you have. The key thing is when you're thinking about buying one, because there's no reason why you might not tomorrow go get Confluence or go get like, a wiki technology. The key thing is to understand what piece of the problem they solve really well, right? So Google Docs really said the thing that we think is important is collaborative editing, right? That is the part of it that actually is like they put a lot of wood behind that arrow, right? But if you look at, for instance, something like GitHub, right? It's much less collaborative real-time editing. It's much more about like we care about the idea that there is, like work happening independently, and collaboration is in these episodic moments. Depending on your style of work, depending on the kind of thing you're building, one of those might be better than another, right? Similarly, when you think about a technology like SharePoint, the relationships between the documents was a critical thing, but the idea that documents themselves could be wired to entire applications was kind of the thing that they were trying to accomplish there. So they weren't really building like SharePoint and Confluence, while they both hold the documents, are actually solving vastly different problems. So the reason I want to beat that horse is because one of the patterns we've seen again and again and again is that people have gone and they've selected an AI technology, or they selected a knowledge-based technology, and it is not actually fit for the purpose that they had. And there's an old saw in I can't remember where it comes from, but it's basically like if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, you will always think you have a stupid fish, right? These are not necessarily stupid fish. It's just that many of them can't climb trees. Anyway, Pete, back to the large language model.
One of my favorite quotes, as you know, Matt. So I think today, what's interesting about today is we've kind of regressed when it comes to provenance. That is to say, generally, right? Because yes, we're aware retrieval augmented generation, and there's a bunch of research in grounding these LMs. But in general, a large language model essentially has taken the internet, processed it, and then done what they're called transformative use. Basically, the way that LLMs are avoiding legal copyright is there's enough modification to the data that's being kind of processed and distilled that it's not one for one. So you're left with this question of when something's being outputted by an LLM, how much impact did I have if it's using my document for retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, which is basically giving it context to theoretically use when it's generating a response, or how much of it's coming from what it was trained on. And that's a really interesting problem because there isn't as much or any provenance generally. There are citations when you use ChatGPT for web search or deep research, it'll cite things. But in general conversation, it's had access to all that data and it's not able to cite it. And that gets interesting because then there comes this question of how valuable the output is, especially in certain sectors. So that's where it's being solved, I think, vertically more than horizontally. Medical field is looking at provenance. Legal field, there's some really interesting examples in legal field as well of provenance, because the impact of not knowing the provenance or letting the LM essentially generate anything has legal impacts as much as anything. So I think that's fascinating when you look at the kind of through line and you get to today and you're like, hey, we're actually at a point where we have very little provenance generally, and it's actually something that's being re-engineered for this new world.
And so as in that context, as you're thinking about the tool sets that you're evaluating, you want to ask yourself the question, is it important for me to be able to say to whatever tool it is, where did you get that? How did you cook that up? Because in a lot of cases for answer bots and things like this, we're seeing the retrofit of quality control technologies in them, and it actually becomes an incredibly important thing. All right, so that kind of brings us to here. And before I go into the notion of like kind of what we're going to show you, we've been talking a bunch about problems of knowledge management, and we've been building a platform to this end. So Pete's going to show you a little bit of that. Before we get there, I think we do have a question in the chat, which just to go through regarding form, it seems it's required to have a specific and standardized form, or is it required to have a specific or standardized form to KB articles? Are there templates or key aspects of a template that you would recommend? How important is metadata and tagging? So it's a great question. I would call out a couple of things. These are things I'm about to give you sort of what we have found to be useful, and then there's a number of other pieces to that, right? But in general, when we look, and you'll see this, the reason I'm sort of bringing this up now is like when you see the demo, you'll kind of see this. When we're thinking about a knowledge-based article, if we're thinking about it from the perspective of this is a KB that a person will use to solve a problem, what we tend to have is we tend to have an overarching section which is around what are the common symptoms of this problem, because we actually can use that information in a debugging thing. So you can imagine it's kind of an input to a RAG. We can actually say, take this section and this is how you look up whether or not this is an appropriate playbook. Secondarily, we then have we usually tend to have a section called requirements, which is effectively, do you need any special access to do this? Are there any particular prerequisites you have to have? That sort of stuff, which is super useful for us, like tools and things like this. Then there's actually a set of steps, right? And the steps are basically written. What we do is we have a sort of a general rubric that says, assume that the person who is executing this step has generalized IT knowledge, but not specific knowledge, right? So that is to say, if you need to have a step that is specific to your environment, you might need to make it explicit. But what we don't do is if a general IT person would know how to do a thing, we do not articulate it all the way down into the gritty details. So that's the deal. If you have if you just went to an IT person who had 5 years worth of experience and said, configure the Okta group. Configuring the Okta group is a thing that they should know how to do. That's not a step that we'd articulate at click level. Whereas if it was something like go into our ERP and configure a thing, your ERP is very specifically configured, so you may want to go click by click. The last part is a verification step. We tend to include this because at the end of doing a set of steps, it's not like, well, thank God that's over, like throw it over your shoulder and we're done. What we do is we actually include some stuff so both another human being could come in and verify whether or not this thing was correctly done, but also the person working it could do it. And we have automation that uses those as well to validate that the things were done. So for instance, if you're giving someone access to a particular application or whatever, the things would be like, then now make sure that they actually are in the right group, make sure that they actually do have access to the thing, and then make sure they actually did log in, that kind of stuff, right? On the notion of tagging, metadata and tagging, the kinds of metadata that are useful for these sorts of things, if you're evaluating a knowledge-based system or you're evaluating how you do knowledge in a knowledge base in a system that isn't primarily a knowledge-based system, the other metadata you're going to want to have is version history. Who edited it? When did they edit it? Right? And the ability to restore and diff, right? So most of your document repositories will have that. The other thing you may want to have, we have this because we have a multiple tiers of system, multiple customers, that sort of stuff, is some notion of document state. Is this thing proposed? Is it approved? Is it deployed? Right? Tagging for us is mostly around applications that are referenced and stuff like this, and so that's actually a thing that can be generated out of the documents. So we don't tend to have as many tags from that perspective. So hopefully that answered your question on sort of like that's what we've seen as being particularly effective. All right, so with that, there's 3 parts to the system that we built. We've got this sort of categorization understanding component that brings in tickets and then maps them to the knowledge base. And that's really the part that Pete's going to show you is sort of like how does our knowledge base function? How do we generate that content and that sort of stuff? Because that was really sort of the core of the conversation that we're having here. So Pete, take it away. I know he's been just itching for me to shut the hell up so he can show you his new stuff.
All right, so we're going to do a demo. It'll be live in that we're hoping that the meta gods are not shining on us the way they did Meta in their glasses demo. If you saw that, just have to pay homage. So the steps here, I'm gonna show you a playbook that I wrote. I didn't get hired for my ability to write IT playbooks, but I think that's actually representative of the quality that in general you'll see out there. So I'll walk you through kind of the playbook I wrote, and then we're going to load it up, and I'll walk you through the product, load it up, and we'll look at the output. So here we go. I wrote this playbook. It's for onboarding a contractor at your company, which is where I work right now. The key thing here, and the reason I like this, is if you think about being able to provide service, onboarding a contractor is going to be specific to every customer. There's no standard way to do it because the systems they have access to, the days they need it and such, is going to all be highly variable. And so this is a good example of personalization and then how you kind of iterate on it. So I've got an overview. I've got some prerequisites that kind of define the systems. I've got some step-by-steps that are the resolution, adding the user to Okta, making sure they have time tracking. And it's not written great, like time tracking is done with Zoho. That's kind of useful. Verification checklists, escalation procedures, depending on things. So this is my PDF. What I'm going to do is I'm in the Fixify product here. I've got the Fixify standard playbooks. These are the playbooks that we provide to every customer. They don't have to use them. They're just available, right? And then we can personalize them or use them out of the box. So I'm going to go into my contract.
And before you go in there, just to call out a couple things, when we were talking about tacit versus explicit knowledge, right? In the knowledge base that we actually have a set of tacit knowledge things that we've actually made explicit. So for instance, in communication style, how do we talk? right? Like that's a thing that like almost no one writes down, but like it's actually really important. Turns out that if you don't tell people like this, we do formality. One of the organizations that we work with, a law firm, one of the things that the CIO does there for every new employee is gets them a copy of a writing book and says like, we're a law firm where the comma is critically important. So that becomes a real thing. Various guidelines and stuff like this. So when you think about building out your knowledge base, you may want to think about, if I have a series of guidelines that apply to all of the ticket processing, right? What would those guidelines be? How do we, resolve things? How do we greet customers? What's our level of formality? How do we handle escalations? When do we, that kind of thing? It's important to sort of separate that out. It doesn't have to be with each one of the playbooks. Sorry, Pete.
No, thank you for that. So we've got a standard kind of generalized playbook. It's not something you'd run necessarily without some customization, especially for contractor onboarding. So we'll just go ahead and I'm going to go and load that PDF that I just showed you up. I'm going to hit confirm. And now the thing I want to call out here is you can see there's a couple icons. There's the current playbook, Jira tickets, grain calls, and then now this PDF. Each one of those is a data source this system is going to access to extract out tribal and tacit knowledge as well as explicit knowledge. So with the current playbook, we're using that to guide the instructions and the form. So that thing about form, we use the Fixify standard playbooks to create a form factor that works for both humans and AI. And that's a kind of a greenfield problem, because up until really a year ago, I would argue most people weren't even trying to solve it that way. So it's still it's a journey, and Matt talked about in answering that Q&A question kind of the form we have, but that form helps guide what gets generated. So for each playbook, there's a generalized structure that we can count on, a human can count on, and an AI can count on. Then Jira tickets, we're looking at the ticket, the comments, and any comments, especially around steps that we're taking. It's one of the ways you can extract tacit or tribal knowledge, because oftentimes people will put notes into things that they've done, but they might not have playbooks with those steps. So you can identify escalation procedures, people who are to be engaged in certain use cases. So, and because part of our system does the categorization, we can focus on the tickets that are related to this category, contractor onboarding, or application access, what have you. So it helps guide the system.
And just
Then, yeah, go ahead.
Just to pause that, if you're trying to build this system yourself by hand, and we wouldn't encourage you to do that, but if you were trying to build this system by yourself, one of the things I would encourage you to do is go back to whatever your ticketing system of record is, pull down, say, 90 days worth of tickets, and take a look at some statistics. There's a few guiding statistics you would look at. Is first off, how often do certain issues come up? That was the thing we talked about in terms of that Pareto curve of how many different tickets you have and that sort of thing, because you really want to focus on building the playbooks for the things that happen a reasonable amount, because you're going to get a lot of leverage, and then the things that happen almost never, because those are the ones you're going to forget how to do. But the second thing is you're going to be able to take a look and say, like, what comments were put in, but you're also going to want to look at who closes most of the tickets, right? If you have one or two people who close every single one of your application access tickets, but they don't have a single comment in it, and pro tip, they're not going to have a single comment in it because nobody ever does, you're going to go to those people and say, just tell me how you do it. Don't bother writing it down. Just tell me in words how you do it. Record that conversation, and then that, like, do the transcript, and that will be the beginnings of your playbook. You don't have to make this a heavy lift if you're data driven by doing it, right? Sorry.
Yeah. And so that's a good segue. So the call logs are actually in customer success calls and stuff. We have access to call logs, and we'll actually process those and include those if they're relevant in this. That in and of itself is an interesting engineering problem. And the last thing that we'll use, it's a source, it's not on this because it's a demo account, is like Slack or Teams. So if we have messages, those messages where it's a thread about access, granting access or what have you, that we learn in conversation, we can then pull in and go from essentially tribal that's written out in conversation to explicit that gets documented. So all of that is to say, we come in here, you hit personalize, you can see that basically we're going to review all the data sources. We're going to look for relevant content based on the categorization and what's in this standard playbook. And then we're going to present you with the option to review the suggestions. And then, as Matt mentioned, there's a state that would allow us to publish it. So I'm going to hit start update. And we've got our beautiful Panda. This is going to take a few minutes. It's actually fast. It's generally fast, but I'm not going to sit here on a webinar and make everyone watch it. I've gone ahead and run it once in another place. And you can see here there's a personalized playbook that's available. So that's a state. Basically, we have something in draft. This is that playbook that I just showed you. So I'm going to click review. I'm going to call out a few things. If you recall from our playbook, we talked about Zoho and Jira. Those show up now as tools that are needed. The other thing that I really want to highlight is when you look at the resolution steps, these slugs here, assign user to Okta, create user group, assign user app. These are hints. So one of the things we're trying to balance is the instructions for a human, and then the natural language that an LLM would follow, along with guidance, hints of what to go do. This is us plugging that in. Every time we build integrations, we provide what are called skills, and they're like how to assign a user to a group in Okta. And now this playbook is referencing those skills, so that as the AI processes this playbook and helps guide the analyst and does some automation on their behalf, it's actually calling the right set of stuff. And you can actually, in this mode, edit what's happening and add other skills that we have available, or change the things that you want. And you can see here that we've gone ahead and like this one is actually a skill where we're pulling the login history. So we actually have a skill that checks if the user was able to log in successfully. So it's referencing that in the playbook. And you can see that that got annotated in there as well. So from here, you could publish, you could edit or discard. And that gets you kind of the first pass. And then as more information is available, you deliver more service, you have more documentation, you would just go through that same process again of updating the personalized playbook, which is what gets generated after this step. And you have an even more personalized to your environment, to your processes playbook. You're muted, Matt.
Well, it had to happen at least once during the
Yeah.
webinar. All right, so with that, so that's a little bit of our nickel tour. I'm thinking about the following things. Like, okay, so first off, we wouldn't be co-founders of a tech company. We're honor bound to tell you we think our stuff's pretty legit. We think we've done some interesting things around this, and Pete's pretty proud of his stuff. So if you are thinking about these problems and want to chat, feel free to reach out. But if you're thinking about going alone, or you're going down this road, here are some things, some lessons learned that we've learned through implementing our own system, but also helping a number of customers and talking to literally hundreds and hundreds of folks in IT about things you should consider, right? If you're thinking about either a knowledge management system for deflection, some sort of answer bot, or a knowledge management system for some sort of like IT ticketing support, like playbooks and things like this. So the first thing I would abjure you to think about is like, how do you connect information up to the bot, right? So like, as you think about this, if you're evaluating a vendor, ask them like, okay, so like, do I have to load all my information into your knowledge base? Do you connect up to multiple different knowledge bases? How does that work? Does the information have to be in a particular format to the form question, or will it go ahead and digest the information? Now, the key thing is you may think, oh, wow, it'll digest whatever information. That's awesome. Let me go ahead and do that one because that'll be easier. Not so fast. If it requires information to be in a particular format, that's good in a sense because it shortens the distance the product has to go to understand what's going on. If it allows a general purpose format, you very much want to make sure, okay, then how do I see what you understood about what I handed you, right? That's kind of a key quality step. Then the other thing is, does whatever system you're buying have some notion of coverage, right? So for instance, in our system, we have these default playbooks, and we have these statistics on how many different tickets we've seen, so we can tell you, hey, the knowledge base right now, it's about a C- because you've got 60% coverage or something like this. So how are you going to understand that, either from the tool or from some mixture of what you understand from your statistics and the tool? Because there's a huge difference between like, hey, we covered the top 5 use cases, and I have one lonesome knowledge base article written in 1987. And then the other thing is, does the system give any notion of what might be useful to add? Right. So like, are there additional suggestions or steps? We have, this giant list of KB articles that are prioritized based on what we've seen. The other thing to think about is provenance. Like, as knowledge is updated in the system, can you see those updates and how do you interact with them? We kind of chose a GitHub approach because, again, we're talking about like online real-time collaborative editing is actually not that much of a problem with knowledge base articles. They're not used that frequently. But what is actually really important is to make sure that the editing experience allows you for some deep quality and consistency. And so GitHub was a better analogy in that context. And then also, can you bring in data from multiple sources? Can you take in voice and text and Slacks and things like this? Or is it primarily a text-based system, right? And you got to make a decision on how much of a deal that is for you. And then the last thing, and I cannot stress this enough, right, is quality control, right? So the number of people we know who are now on their second answer bot, and several people who are on their third, because the quality to the end user wasn't very good. And so in that context, the questions I would ask the vendor are questions I would make sure I understood were things like, is there some sort of interactive loop that I can test what I'm going to get from the system, right? So if I'm talking about a deflection bot, can I go ahead and load in a bunch of data and then ask it questions and have it produce answers for me as a thing, right? And can I then lather, rinse, and repeat? And once it's done, how do I monitor the quality when it's running, right? How do I monitor what my end users are getting? Or to Pete's point earlier, how do I monitor which knowledge base articles are being used the most so I make sure that things are right and good? And how do I monitor adherence to those knowledge base articles? Because at the end of the day, whether you're using automation or people or a mixture, you want to make sure the deviation is tracked and adjusted to. Anyway, as you're evaluating the systems, kind of keep those things in mind. These are the forever problems, and different technologies are better at different things. So those are the things we'd do. If you kind of pay attention and make some intentional decisions there, you can avoid a lot of the pitfalls we've seen people run into. Anyway, so that's kind of our nickel tour. At this point, we'd open it up to questions.
Great, thanks so much. We did have 2 more questions come in. So the first one we've got is, you talked a lot about deploying these systems and patterns you've seen. Are there any anti-patterns you've seen?
Yes, there are. So the first one I would say is particularly with things that are publicly facing. So here we're thinking deflection bots and stuff like this is the like, let's just let her rip, right? That's the sort of what I refer to this pattern of like, we're going to go to an all hands meeting. We're going to announce, hey, next week we're going to have this new assist bot in the channel. You're going to see it, make sure to ask it questions and stuff like this. And then we deploy it to great fanfare and it blows up in our face because every single technology wilts a little bit. Doesn't matter how good it is or how AI it is when it hits the real world. And so sort of the corrective pattern to that we've seen is people say, hey, we're going to deploy this answer bot to a subset of users or a subset of people, and we're going to kind of get some stats and understand what it is before we roll it out, right? Everybody's under tremendous pressure to go, smear some AI on everything. But in this case, that's very much a thing that I would do. The other anti-pattern I would call out is most folks, and this has happened with other technologies too, but AI, it seems to be particularly pernicious, is deploying these new technologies without any notion of what it's actually going to change or fix or make better, right? Like you should probably have, if you're deploying like say a deflection bot or an answer bot, have a notion of, and this will change the number of tickets the team has to work themselves by X%. That's our guess. We're going in with that guess and we will measure and we will report back, because absent an ROI calculation, it's very easy to just get lost in the fog of war, right? So being not metrics driven about this sort of thing is very much a problem. And then the last piece is, I think, that notion, knowledge management of like, and the beatings will continue until morale improves, right? Like we're just going to just write the hell out of some knowledge base articles, not necessarily the thing. You can be more data driven.
Great. And the last one we've got, what are the minimum must-haves before turning on an AI deflection bot, especially around the knowledge base? How do you gauge if you have enough coverage to start?
I think fundamentally it's about understanding what your most common questions are, right? And if you have about 65 to 70% coverage, what we've seen is that the types of questions, if you take all the questions and you categorize them properly and you sort of stack them on the x-axis, you're going to end up with a curve that looks about like that. And in that first envelope, that 63% of your stuff is going to be a class of questions. If you have enough to cover those, and then you have a decent escalation path for questions that aren't covered by the knowledge bot, you're probably going to be in pretty reasonable shape, is sort of what we've seen. Calling out that in that you definitely want to have some statistics to back that up, and then you want to go in and do some QA testing on it to make sure that it's not just handing out random answers.
All right, and keeping you on your toes, we actually had another question come in. So what should they watch out for when integrating this with a ticketing system?
It's a great question. So there's a couple things I would say, but before that, Pete has integrated our system with like 7 different ticketing systems. So Pete, what are the anti-patterns we see in ticketing systems?
Yeah, I think the ticketing system generally, a big one is, how does it treat internal comments? Internal comments are used to both track status, but they could also be somewhat restricted information, like information about offboarding an employee or the timing of that. And so being really cognizant of what information the bot you're integrating with has access to. And then the flip side of that is, when you look at a ticketing system, does it have the concept of kind of privileged information? We integrate with some ticketing systems that are really more for other use cases, other verticals, so things like engineering or project management. They don't have some of the constructs that a ticketing system that is built for IT has. And so just understanding the trade-offs is, I think, kind of key in that, in making a conscious decision of how you're using your ticketing system and then what you want the bot to do and deflect with, because you can run a lot of risk if you don't think about that ahead of time.
I'll also call out two other things, which is when you're thinking about, like if you like, and I'll take the context of the question to be like, hey, look, I'm thinking about getting data out of my ticketing system for the purposes of training up either a bot or integrating with one of these knowledge management systems, that sort of stuff. One of the things that is kind of difficult with ticketing systems is the notion of their state management can be vastly different. And so the kinds of things that you can get out of it, like if I'm setting up an answer bot, the two things I want to know are how many tickets of different types that I have are, and like, you know, you may not have the right fields to even determine that if the ticketing system has like, oh, well, that's the third thing that happens and it's in this text field over here. But secondarily, like understanding like, and how long did it take to close various fields, various tickets and stuff like this is going to be critical to understanding if your project was successful. But you might not even have that data, or it might be like 7 timestamps in. And so those things I would get a CSV dump of your existing ticketing system and say, okay, the fields I'm going to use to categorize the tickets for the purposes of my data extraction is this field here, and I can absolutely see that it's the right set of stuff. And then two, when I think about the metrics I'm going to collect for what was and wasn't deflected, do I have a deflection state? And if so, am I taking a timestamp on that? And is the bot updating that timestamp? These are things that I would have in order to understand that your ticketing system is actually going to help you get done the thing that you need to get done, right?
Next question is, how much time should I plan to train my bot?
I'm not sure as much as a time as it like like if you're gonna kind of fix the deflection bot to answer one question and you test that one question, again, that Pareto curve, I would encourage you not to think about it as time, but the kind of use cases and optimizing for the use case. And I think there's an iterative component of rolling it out to a use case and having it kind of affixed to that versus saying, my deflection bot has all of the content in the world and it's going to try to reason about and answer questions just generally, especially if it's designed to create space for IT. It might be counterintuitive, but I would approach it iteratively and be really cognizant of the quality of those first set of use cases. Because if you lose the trust of your stakeholders, being your end users that are supposed to get value from this thing, you've not created any space and you likely won't get any return on that investment because they're not going to go back to it. So I wouldn't think about it so much as time in training. I think about it as time in arming and the efficiency around the use case and then iterating from there.
Yeah.
But it's an ongoing journey. It's not, I don't think there's a stop.
And the only thing I would call out there is when you think about the actual activity of training, depending on the technology you're using, you may literally be talking about a fast loop where you're like, I want to train up on one question, right? So I'm going to ask this question and it's going to give me an answer and I'm going to up and down arrow it and then I'm going to give it some more data and I'm going to ask the question again. So you're literally in a fast loop. And this is something I won't give you an exact, but I will give you, it would be measured in days, right? To really tune it up on a particular question. But the key thing is then when you deploy it, you want to deploy it to a limited group of folks to get enough coverage. Well, if you're an average organization of a couple hundred people, you're probably getting asked each question like once a week, right? Or once every couple of days. So in order to get enough question coverage in the real world to be able to say, it's ready for prime time, you're probably talking about a couple months, right? And so at that point, you're really saying, I can train up very quickly. It's not actually the technological limitation, it's the organizational limitation of that testing period and that burn-in that you really want to have. Because the thing that's amazing, and so we discovered this the hard way, just as a fun side story, right? Is that like we built, a part of our system has a sentiment analysis component built in. So we're keying off of words that people use and this sort of stuff to understand the emotion as they're asking questions because it helps prioritize requests and stuff. I mean, it's next generation IT, right? But what we didn't take into account was that people sometimes express that with emojis, right? And it was like, oh, okay, emojis and leet speak, great. We wouldn't have seen that unless we actually went to the real world and understood that actually there, in some organizations, they use certain emojis ironically. Right. And so you end up in a situation where you're like, oh my God, okay, yeah. It's that class of learning that you really only see once you get into the environment and you go, haha, okay, yes. Or hey, in this organization, they have a nickname for a particular system. And like we didn't train on that because we didn't see it in the corpus because it was developed later. Like it's that class of stuff you only see in the real world, and you want to let enough burn in time so you don't end up stepping on that. Because when you take the victory lap, oh my God, you need it to be a victory, right? So that's my overall thing. So I think training is probably not that long of the time, but the deployment in the rest of the organization is measured in human deployment terms, which is usually like a quarter.
Awesome. It looks like those were all the questions we had today. Thank you to everyone who attended our webinar. We will be in touch, sharing the recording out, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great one.